Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Produce Your Podcast YouTube channel. My name is Stephanie. I'm on the team here at PYP, and I oversee all things business development, marketing, and in turn, I am one of the people that helps podcast hosts to grow their visibility, their downloads, their audience, and their results in terms of monetization through their podcasts. So, one of the things we want to do today is just answer the big question, which is how do I drive traffic to my podcast? And what's really interesting about this question in particular is that there are a number of foundations that we want to make sure you have before we ever get started on maybe the advanced strategies, right? We sometimes get questions around, should I do some type of ad buy to increase my downloads? Should I invest in paid advertising, maybe some traffic for my YouTube channel, right? All of those are fair game questions. But before we dive headfirst into those, I want to cover some of the basics that we just want to make sure you have in place before you go to essentially step 2 or level 2 of your growth strategy. So, how do we drive traffic to our podcast? What are those foundations? Number one, I want you to look at your website. And this is really interesting because, like I said, I work in business development. I host a lot of these sales consultations that come in through our team calendars. And, sometimes when an existing show comes in, one of our questions actually on our booking form is send me a link to your show. We'll usually get a Spotify link, we'll get an Apple iTunes link. And then because we work with brands and businesses, my next step is always go to their website to get briefed on who they are, what they do, who they serve, all of that good stuff. And what's really interesting is that probably 7 times out of 10, the podcast is completely off of the website, which is really surprising because, again, these are brands and businesses. They put a lot of time, money, and effort into their website. They send prospects to their website. Sometimes there's a portal within their website that their clients use to log into and access their services. And the podcast is nowhere to be found. So I want you to take this moment and do kind of a quick audit of your own website as well. And you have a couple different options for how all of this can integrate. Number one, there are podcast player plugins. It'll go right across the top of your website, and you can actually have that so it'll always play your latest episode. That's just a quick and easy. Again, it's usually a plugin. Your website person can help you add that. So that's number one. Number two, you can actually create a page or just a tab in your navigation bar of your website that drives traffic to an actual podcast page. Now, there's a number of things you can do on a podcast page. You can put your entire web player in there. You can link to the show on a lot of different places. You can add your videos, right? Top 5 fan favorite episodes, but giving it that dedicated place so that when people are already spending time on your website, they're finding the podcast that way. And a third one that I would have you think about, and there's so many creative ways to go about it, but again, I promise I'm just doing foundations today. The third one is to integrate your podcast into your blog. SEO, search, Google, all of that is one of the biggest ways that people find new podcasts. Podcasting really can help boost your SEO. You can be posting your show notes onto your website, which your show notes should be SEO optimized, so double check that as well. But you can be putting those as a blog post right on your website. You can have a nice little audio player that plays the podcast episode that goes along with that post. And if you're doing video, if you add the video into that blog post, that's another huge boost for SEO. So we just want to make sure that foundationally you are covered on that website because, again, we work with brands and businesses. We know how much goes into the website, right? We even recently revamped ours, and I always joke, I think that process will never be done, but it's a huge piece of real estate that we know you're always working on. So just don't forget to integrate the podcast into that. Now, secondly, which is probably no surprise to you, is social media. And social media is probably the number one thing that we get questions on because algorithms are always changing, the formats are always changing, what works best here might not work here, right? And it does require a little bit of a workflow. So if you are someone right now, maybe you are DIYing your podcast and you feel like you don't have the bandwidth to get a social media campaign or just overall marketing plan in place, or you're working with someone who doesn't offer that, therefore it's not happening, we do recommend that you get that gap plugged, right? Video right now, and gosh, I hope I'm not aging this video prematurely, but video right now is really powerful across any number of platforms. And there's so many tools and there's so many great options out there for you to create audiograms, videograms. You can be writing social media captions from your episode transcripts. So what we want to do to kind of zoom 50,000 feet out, when it comes to social media, we want you to take that podcast episode, slice and dice it, repurpose it, use it all over social media, because it'll actually cut down on a lot of your content creation time, but it's going to require a strategy. So if you're not doing it, or you're kind of doing it, but you feel like it's not super effective, that's why I would recommend reaching out to us at Produce Your Podcast. I'll throw my hat in the ring for that, because we can help you demystify that. Again, sometimes we find, especially with social media, sometimes a knowledge gap just kind of leads to inaction, but it's not the hardest gap for us to fill. So let us help you work through that. So we're here talking about how to drive traffic to your podcast. What are the foundational things that we want to make sure you have in place before you go into paid ads, before you optimize your YouTube, right? Like, what are the baseline step zero things that we need you to be doing? We've talked a little bit about your website. We are talking about social media. Number 3 is all about email marketing. Again, this is one of the biggest things that we hear. It's usually a bandwidth issue. But for a lot of people, they say, I've got an email list of people that would love this content, right? Or I've built an email list, but I haven't emailed them. I'm not emailing them regularly, whatever that thing is. But we want you getting your content in front of your warm audiences. Your email list is a warm audience. These are people that have already raised their hand in some way, shape, or form and said, hey, I'm interested in what you have to say. So we want to be integrating the podcast into that. That could be a blurb in your regular newsletter. Even better, you could make your whole email newsletter based on your podcast episodes where it makes sense, linking back to some favorite episodes. There's a lot you can do to, number 1, generate clicks and listens and engagement. But again, sometimes it's a bandwidth issue. So that's a question that we want you to ask yourself and say, hey, if this isn't happening, it's low-hanging fruit. What can I do to plug that gap? Or who do I need to bring on my team to support me in that, so I can start reaching out to my warm audience with my podcast episodes, right? And how do I do that consistently? Again, these are the foundations that we want to make sure that you are still hitting. Now, number 4 might come as a surprise to you. It's actually all word of mouth. So I mentioned before that SEO is a major way that people find new podcasts. Obviously, social media is one as well. But believe it or not, one of the top ways that people find new podcasts to listen to is through friends and family or someone else that they trust making that recommendation. So what does this mean for you? Number 1, asking your clients to share out the show, right? Asking your biggest supporters, hey, if this episode resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear this. You can put it in your social media captions. Hey, tag a doctor who needs to hear this, or hey, tag a lawyer who should tune into this, or I don't know, tag a dog mom that should be hearing this episode. Get your people, that warm audience that we talked about, to start sharing your show out. Because again, if you get a recommendation from somebody that you know, like, and trust, you're more likely to listen to it. So we want to be activating your audience to start sharing that out. If you are hosting your podcast to drive results in your business, this is another way to just increase your lead and prospect pool, which I think every business wants. So that word of mouth is going to be super important. Similarly, if you are going to industry conferences, trade shows, you're speaking on stage, whatever, make sure you are bringing up, hey, I've got this podcast. We've seen a lot of different creative ways of doing this. Most notably, I always think back to one of the shows in our portfolio, which is Salad with a Side of Fries. That show host, her name is Jen, an amazing show. Make sure you check it out. She sponsored part of an event show, and she had napkins for salad with a side of fries at the meals of that event with a QR code to go and listen to her show. She passed them out. They were on all of the tables. People are handing each other napkins when they need one. It's a really nice kind of grassroots way to hit the people that are right in front of you. And again, we talked about using your current audience to share your show with more people who should be in your audience. And 5th and final, this might sound kind of silly, but again, we see it missing all the time. Make sure you are distributing your podcast to all of the platforms. There are a lot out there. And if you launched your show several years ago, or your show's been live for a couple months, things are kind of always changing in this industry. This directory gets bought by this directory shut down, this one's the number one, right? I just had a conversation earlier this week where I have an iPhone, so I was using Apple Podcasts to look for the show. It didn't pop up. I was able to find that show on Spotify, but I had asked the host, I said, "Oh, is there any reason that you're not distributing to Apple Podcasts? I was able to find you on Spotify, but nowhere else." And they were like, "What are you talking about?" I had no idea. So that is, again, very, very simple foundational things. Directories and platforms in particular, that can all be done through your media host. So if you are the person doing that, make sure you hop in there and double check it. If you're not sure, get a support team in place to help you. And just make sure you're everywhere that you need to be. Do not miss out on that low-hanging fruit. So that is your quick tip. I don't know how quick I can consider that because we covered 5 things, but I do hope this was helpful. Again, we are here to talk about how to drive traffic to your podcast. My name is Stephanie. I'm on the Produce Your Podcast team. Make sure you hang around our channel. We've got plenty of other videos coming your way. All things business growth and podcasting, lots to do with formatting your podcast to attract listeners, keep them engaged, things you need to know as technology and the industry continues to evolve. And until next time, happy podcasting. Thanks so much.